Human culture thrives when discussions about what is true, what is just, and what is beautiful is remembered as an ongoing, never-ending, never-complete conversation. To quote Milton, by the known rules of ancient liberty, welcome to Risky Conversations. I am your co-host, Ace Deliri. Join us as we engage in this ancient tradition of discussions around interesting topics with utterly fascinating people.
Welcome to today's episode. We're going to be joined by our friend Mike Driver. Mike, please take the floor and give us your introduction, and we'll take it from there.
Great. Well, thanks very much for having me on. It's a pleasure and an honour to be here. I'll try and give you the reasonably short version of my history because I am fairly old. So I came out of university back in '92. I do have an economics degree, don't hold it against me. And I was messing around with some post-grad stuff, looking at game theory, and kind of got a bit disillusioned with that, which we'll probably get back to because I think we're going to perhaps kick off around negotiation. But came out of there in '92, and I started a company. We had a rented office space, like a serviced office space, so a very small room you could just about fit 2 desks in. A brown Hyundai Pony. I don't know if you've ever seen a brown Hyundai Pony, but I certainly don't recommend them. And you could rent that at £8 a day.
Wow.
And we started with £2,000. We built that company from '92 to 2006, and then sold 39% to private equity in '06, and that was my first liquidity moment, or I think the common parlance amongst the Twitter fraternity is "fuck you money." So that am I allowed to swear, by the way?
Of course.
Okay, well, yeah. I don't think we're going to stop me. So that was a good day, and I stayed in the private equity world for a little while. I think we might get to private equity in this conversation as well. I think my summary of private equity is a line I stole from Nassim. Couldn't find a coconut on Coconut Island. Lovely people though, really nice people, lovely people. But yeah, dumb. So stayed in private equity for a little while, and then when that was done, we sold the business on. I was looking around for something else to do. My kids were sort of probably like 8 and 10, so I couldn't sort of hang around at home. So I needed to find something else to do in my life, and I quite enjoyed the process of selling the business. We had 6 offers. When we did sell it,
What kind of business was it?
So it sort of grew and mutated, but we actually started out selling office equipment. So I literally went from a PhD in game theory to knocking on doors collecting compliment slips. So that's a way to build humility. So we started. We had nothing when we started. We'd collect 50 compliment slips every day. We'd call these businesses. We'd sell them something that we didn't have a recognized dealership to resell. We'd finance it. We didn't even have a relationship with a finance company. We literally started right at the bottom. And in the end, we became more of a document management, intelligent managed print company. So end-to-end document management, scan, archive, retrieval. I don't know, probably had 400 staff. I'm going to do all the numbers in pounds because it's a bit easier at the end, probably sort of 40 million pounds turnover. So, sizable business covering the whole of the UK. And it went through, made every single mistake it's possible for a human being to make in the 16, 17 years that I ran it.
Oh, give us your top 3.
Oh, hiring the wrong people. That will be 1, 2, and 3. I still struggle with that, and apologies to anyone currently working for me for that comment. But I still the thing is, when you're interviewing somebody, when you want to hire somebody in business, if you know what you're doing, it's normally because you've gone past the point where you really needed them.
Right.
If that makes sense. So you're so prone to believe that person can solve your problem. That you will, and everybody does it, and it's something you have to work very, very hard to stop doing, which is hiring the wrong people and keeping the wrong people for long enough, for too long. Sorry. So that I'd say that's the biggest problem. I made all the other common mistakes as well, but we grew turnover and profit every quarter for 16 years. And I worked out a stat the other day that in 27 years of being in business, I've had 2 loss-making quarters.
And well, you know what? I don't think Twitter's made a profit just yet. You know what I mean? From what I gather, so it's quite refreshing to speak to somebody who's. I mean, if you're going to run a business and if it's not profitable, I don't think you can call it a business until it becomes profitable. Before that, it's just a hobby of yours, for lack of a better term.
It's a bit of a pun, but after survival, profit is the only thing that counts.
Right.
So sort of finish off the potted history. So I enjoyed selling the business, so I decided to go into investment banking or corporate finance. I mean, how hard can that be? So I bought out my advisors. A couple of the older guys were sort of near retirement and wanted to do a couple of other things. So I bought them out. It was a small advisory firm. It didn't cost me a tremendous amount of money. And I decided to refocus. I thought there was a real gap in the market to provide unconflicted advice to entrepreneurs. When I was selling my business, and you go through the process, and on the other side of the table there's your PwCs, your KPMGs, your Deloittes, and so on, EYs. I would look to the side of the table, look at these people, and I'd have 2 questions. What have you ever done, and can I trust you? And the answer to those questions would normally be not much and probably not. So I thought that there'd be a space in the market to provide unconflicted advice to entrepreneurs, pretty much sell side only. And yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's an idea gone mad. In the last sort of 9 years or so, 8-9 years, I've sold I've negotiated the sale of about £3 billion worth of entrepreneur-owned businesses, maybe just short of that.
Right on. So I assume your hypothesis has proven to be correct. Are you still in that business?
Yeah. No, Convex is still flying along. We've sold 8 businesses this year. So we sell businesses sort of value normally somewhere between 10 and 200 million. Although recently we seem to have graduated, and we do have a couple of clients at the moment in the billions. So that's going to be, the next challenge, to see if we can make that move up the food chain. So
what kind of businesses are we talking about? Are we like every kind of business, or are you specifically target?
Our target is really the capital structure. So it's owner managed businesses. I mean, obviously it's growing, profitable owner managed businesses, but it could be in any sector. To give you some example, I sold a business 3 or 4 years ago that built artificial simulators of drilling platforms. So you learn to fly in an aeroplane simulator. So this business built drilling for oil simulators.
Okay.
It's a fantastic business. Basically, based on an artificial intelligence asset, built up over many years. But you would never set out to as advisor, or I think I'll see if I can sell something that that it's so unique of its own self. So really, what we aim for is is the capital structure, the growing part, and the profitable part.
So the parts that make a business.
Yeah, it's the people, really.
Of course, of course. So I'm very curious about the whole game theory situation. So would you mind explaining to us what your understanding of game theory is and why it doesn't work, and what did you learn while you were trying to pursue it?
Okay, well, obviously not very much. I mean, I apologize to, current students of game theory here for I'm going to be very simplistic. Firstly, because I can't really remember very much of it. And secondly, to be fair, game theory has moved on a little bit, and I believe there is a lot more dynamism in it now. But obviously, I think it's a good jumping off point to take sort of the original tenets or the basic tenets of game theory and sort of work out why they don't really work. From a negotiation standpoint, what are the limits? So, what is game theory? Essentially, it's taking into account, the impact of my moves or my decisions on the other side in a negotiation. Or for the sake of negotiation, we'll define it like that. So, let's come back to that in a minute. The impact that my moves have on the other side.
Okay.
Then the game relies on people acting rationally, and hopefully that's going to be a really important word which we come back to. Everybody knows the boundaries, and I'm going to do the Captain Kirk thing when we get to talk about that. Knowing the other side is equally cognizant and plays by the rules. Yeah, and you've seen me tweet out deception is Darwinian probably 50 million times, so I'll come back to that.
Yep.
Most importantly, and this is really interesting, and most people jump to the wrong side of this, so it's quite interesting to have a chat about this, is knowing when the game starts or finishes.
Okay.
Most people say, oh, yeah, you never know where the game finishes, but actually you can't be sure that you knew where the game started either. And I'll come back to that in a second. And so finally, I guess my overarching point here is you really don't want to be using anything that puts you in an intellectual straitjacket.
Right.
Because that precludes the use of your number one weapon, which is instinct. So if we run back through, let me try and think. So we're talking about the impact that your moves have on the other side. So yeah, I mean, I think that's that's a fair starting point. Game theory, let's have a think about how what we do and what we say affects the other side. And what most people do there is they say, well, what would I do? What would I do in this circumstance if I was faced with this particular move or this particular negotiation point? And that's one thing. But what I'm going to talk about today, I call it the game of life theory.
Okay.
So we sort of move on from game theory. So where do I move on from taking into account the impact of my actions? Where I go is something that I call aggressive empathy.
Okay.
So it's not enough really to think about the impact that your moves make. You really need to be assuming the personality of your opponent. So that's like taking off your personality, like an overcoat, and putting their personality on. Not just what they say and do, how they think, but also how they feel. And that is a deep understanding. That is a lot more than walking a mile in their shoes. So that will be the first area of improvement on game theory, if you like. I guess the second point is this rationality point that we talked about before. When I see the word rationality, I just see the word predictability. Mm-hmm. The minute you are rational, you are predictable. Trump is many, many things, but he is a nightmare for people, and he's a proven nightmare. Whatever you think about Donald Trump, either way, he won an election to be president of the United States, and he won because he was completely unpredictable to people who had no way of computing his lack of predictability. So
works out to his advantage when he's negotiating with people like the chairman of North Korea.
Yeah, look, I don't think he's too many issues negotiating with the chairman of North Korea. Maybe probably one or two more issues with China. He holds a lot of cards. The US is the most powerful country in the world by any measure. But I think the fact that he can be irrational means that he can be unpredictable. So you definitely don't want to be entering a negotiation where you are reliant on other the other party being rational, and you certainly don't want to be predictable yourself. In fact, one of the most important things that you can do in a negotiation is control your own predictability. You don't want the other side to be able to predict what you're doing.
How would you do that?
Oh yeah, it's really interesting. You genuinely do things and argue. You would argue. I've argued for weeks for something that I didn't really want.
Just to throw the other person off.
Yeah, basically, you want the other person unbalanced. You want to tug on the rug. So if I've argued for hours or days or weeks for something that isn't really important to me, then I give it up. Did you win?
Ah, I see. I think I
feel
won.
like you did.
That's right.
Yeah. So you don't want to be rational because rationality equals predictability. So what else? Let me think. What's the other thing? Okay, so we do want to talk about boundaries.
Yeah.
So I can tell my favorite story. I think this is the most important lesson. And I've taught. It's the most important lesson I've taught to my kids. It's the most important lesson I've taught to anybody who ever works for me. I think it's the most important lesson you can learn in life, and it's about boundaries. And it has a Star Trek reference, which makes it's from Star Trek. It's the Kobayashi Maru test, which you'll be familiar with, but I will elucidate. So the Kobayashi Maru test is a test given to Starfleet officers that it is impossible to pass. You will fail it, and the whole point of the test is to see how you cope with the failure. You know, at least some or all of the spaceships involved in the Kobayashi Maru test will explode, and many humans and aliens will die, and you will fail. And the whole point of the test is to see how you fail. And no one has ever passed the test apart from Captain Kirk. So how did Captain Kirk pass the test? He broke into the test center the night before and reprogrammed the computer. So it doesn't matter. You find me a computer that can beat me at chess or poker or Go or whatever. Within your closed system, it can beat me at chess or Go or poker. But the minute I step outside the boundary and unplug the computer, you're screwed. So, if you game theory it relies on everyone knowing the boundaries. Success in life is basically ignoring boundaries. To a greater or lesser degree, or of that nature.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It ties back into our friend Joe Norman's conversation we had a while back with regards to people who use chess as an analogy to how to proceed through life, and how they try to contain life within a chessboard. And he keeps telling them that life contains chess cannot contain life, but people do make that mistake. So your idea here of, I would imagine you would do very well negotiating across somebody like Gary Kasparov, who spouts everything and anything that has to do with life in relation to chess and only chess.
Well, I mean, I don't know if they attribute the quote, don't they, about the pigeon and the chessboard to Putin about armor. I'm not sure if it's actually true, but I think, on Kasparov's chessboard, I'd be the pigeon shitting on his rook.
Okay, that's a great way to think about it, because what this ties into is this idea that yourself, me, and Jaffer are always talking about on Twitter, which is this idea of anti-fragility. So what I would like for you to explain is, how do you understand anti-fragility and how do you apply it to business? Because you and I were involved in a Twitter thread with relation to how not everybody is built to be anti-fragile, especially when it comes to the business mindset. So if you don't mind, please elaborate for our listeners what your understanding of anti-fragility is and how it relates to business.
Okay, well, I think the way I look at it is I look at two concepts that I have: super redundancy and the search for arbitrage. So we kind of probably explore those two areas, if you like. So if you think about, I guess that some of this will probably relates to ergodicity and ergodic systems as well. So I think when you think about anti-fragility, you really need to be thinking about complex domains, open systems, non-linear systems. These are the kinds of terminologies that people will be familiar with, because ultimately you need to be thinking about survival. You can't make any money in business if you don't survive. So serial redundancy is only investing small amounts of money or in an idea or a project or a particular service or product, whatever it might be. Trial and error, testing the market. If it fails, you live to fight another day. You avoid ruin, which is the most important thing. If the product is successful, or the service is successful, you get your investment after it. You push after it, and you never bet more than you can afford to lose, and you are able then to give yourself the opportunity, as I call it, to fall over opportunity. So give yourself the chance to fall over opportunity. So you're not trying to predict. We're going to go off on all kinds of tangents here, so I'll try and keep it within the boundaries. But you're not necessarily even trying to predict what will be successful and what isn't. What you do is you try any number of things via instinct, via experience, and hopefully you have an emergent service, an emergent product, something that becomes successful, and then you can capitalize on that opportunity. So you stay alive long enough to actually fall over opportunity. I think the technical term is radical or ontological emergence, is that something comes out of your trial and error process that could never have been predicted, that was completely unpredictable. And the business world is full of that kind of opportunity where people are capitalized. So serial redundancy. So the knowledge we get from tinkering, from trial and error, is superior to the knowledge we get from reasoning, because it interacts with the working of the world. It interacts with the working of the world over time. So for me, business is stay alive long enough to fall over opportunity. Will be my summary, and then capitalize. And most arbitrage is temporary, and then capitalize on the arbitrage when you find it.
Fair enough, because this kind of feeds back into your original jumping off point, which is that if you're in this mindset, anything and everything to do with game theory with relation to predictability kind of falls flat on its face, because if it's predictable, then it's not something that should necessarily give itself opportunity for arbitrage, because if everybody prices it in, there's no profit to be made. But what you're saying is that the real world doesn't work like that. The real world is unpredictable, and if you happen to take small bets and not hit ruin, eventually one of those bets will find an opportunity that will pay off to cover all your losses and then some. Would that be an accurate summary of what you just stated?
Absolutely, yeah. There is no profit in what everybody knows. Right. To add to the sum of all knowledge, if you like, you have to be comfortable with uncertainty. My view is that entrepreneurialism is surviving the dance, or a dance with uncertainty, if I could put it like that. Whereas I'm trying to think what the opposite to an entrepreneur is. Say, I don't know, conformists. Conformists fear the unknown. Yeah,
right.
They have a pathological desire for certainty and predictability.
That feeds into this, because I wanted to ask you. So you're a founder of a company, and you are doing great, and then all of a sudden it's time for you to pass the reins over, and sometimes it's to your child, or sometimes it's to a MBA/PhD CEO. And then the mindset, I don't know if it really necessarily follows through with what you were trying to do with regards to embracing uncertainty, whereas the person you may hand that business off to may not necessarily have that same mindset to come into play. Do you see that frequently, or is that me making a stab in the dark at it?
Well, I think if you're going to hand your business over to someone who doesn't understand uncertainty, you want to be making sure you've sold 100% of it.
Well, that's definitely true. But I'm saying that we notice this very, very frequently because a lot of the companies that were started off eventually become run by people with degrees in various fields, whereas the entrepreneur who started it was more than likely a dropout, right? So the gap between the pedigree from A to B is almost always the length of A to Z, right? So in that instance, I do notice that what you're stating happens to be a reflection of what actually Wall Street wants, for example. Like, oh, hey, Steve Jobs was a dropout, but we want Tim Cook, who has an MBA and who has X, Y, and Z. Nothing wrong with Tim Cook in this particular instance. I'm just pointing that out as a thing that they were talking about, because as soon as the reins of Apple were handed to him, everything that was brought up about him was his, pedigree with regards to logistics and supply chain management and all those things, with none of which were the original strong feature sets of somebody like Steve Jobs. Right? So it's just trying to create that contrast between what exactly it is you're describing versus what eventually ends up potentially happening.
Well, none of those things will ever help you grow a business, but they are kind of useful
Right.
in running a business. But I mean, I think I said on Twitter before, corporatism is particularly politically postponed bankruptcy, which is probably a little harsh. But what I mean from that in the broader view is taking Apple as an example. Once you've got that level of market power, you can argue that for a period of time you need a different set of skills. You certainly need a different. I mean, I've often found in businesses I've run, I'm not a process guy, so you certainly need that. But look, opportunity, it lies in the unknown, and
Right.
I don't know Tim Cook, but I suspect not that he has the entrepreneurial capability to embrace the unknown, to embrace uncertainty. And so that there won't be any progress, or it's unlikely there'll be no progress unless they get lucky. And let's not negate or discount the fact that they could get lucky. They could get lucky that there's somebody in their organization who is capable, who's going to come up with some new ideas or find a new way forward. So there's many things that mean the business can be rejuvenated, but I suspect they are on a very long, slow decline. But in the meantime, they have a walled garden, which they can maximize by draining every single penny out of those of us locked in the garden.
Yeah, no, you know what? This is a conversation between myself and a couple of friends from the firm. What we're talking about is that you can be wrong as long as you have money. Right? Just the minute you're out of money, you're no longer able to be wrong. So they have a very nice cushion for how many wrong bets they can place. But what's interesting about this is I wanted to take your take on it is the amount of luck that's been discounted. Because every time you hear an entrepreneur, and I noticed this very, very instinctively, is that when you hear somebody who actually started the company, they'll tell you, oh, I got really lucky because X happened and then Y happened. I just happened to be in the right place and I managed to, make a go of it. Whereas when you hear sort of the corporatist side of things, it's almost always like, well, we planned this, we had a 10-year plan and we executed on this and we analyzed that. And it seems like one group is fully acknowledging the aspect of luck in their life, and the other group is almost, despite the amount of luck they had, are trying to override that by stating that it was their intelligence and their eloquence that kind of overcame the potential obstacles. Do you find that to be the case, or is this just me reading into the quote unquote snippets that the press releases a bit too much?
No, I agree 100%. I actually think it's actually a little worse than that. So even worse than that. So what we as entrepreneurs do is we recognize, as you say, that most of what happens to us is a function of just being around long enough to have fallen over opportunity, which is just another way of saying to be lucky. Amazon, Bezos did it with AWS. There was never any intention to build that service, and they tripped over it and there it was. But what's even worse about it is when we start explaining how we made it to normal people, we find ourselves rationalizing like we had a plan all along.
Right.
So rather than say, someone say, well, how did you grow that business? I said, well, I just basically managed to survive long enough is that until I came across something that worked. And you change that into, I had this overarching plan, because that's the way, trying to explain to normal people how serial redundancy works is quite a difficult thing to do. What you don't have a particular target or plan in mind, no. There's some overarching strategic goal, but no particular, tactical plan other than to survive. A lot of people don't understand that. I read a book by Rory Sutherland recently, and he's got a fantastic analogy for this, which really annoyed me, because it's been something I've been talking about for a long time, and I can come up with an analogy even 50th as good as Rory's. So he talks about when you climb a mountain. So that's that you've never climbed before, or it can never have been climbed before, and there's loads of blind alleys and double backs and box canyons, and you go up a little bit, it's too steep, you go back down, your way's blocked by a river, whatever it is, and you're all over the place, you zigzag, you go back on yourself, and eventually, after many false starts, you get to the top. Right. And when you get to the top and look down, the way up looks really clear.
Yes.
So the entrepreneur is the person who does all of that back and forth up the mountain, and the corporate guy, the consultant, is the guy who looks down and says, "Well, that was the way up."
Well, see, what I like about that is it can actually tie back into your actual, the reason you and I became friends on Twitter is that when you have this mindset and you're advising the entrepreneur who's selling the business, clearly at the negotiations table, you come at it from the perspective of understanding serial redundancy, understanding arbitrage and convexity. And the person you're speaking to is almost exactly the mirror image of you in the opposite direction. It's almost like Matrix with Neo and Agent Smith. So when it comes to negotiations, because everybody wants to learn, how do you apply your trade in that regard, in the sense that you come into it as an entrepreneur, and the person sitting across from you comes at it from a, I guess, so to speak, business school mindset? And what do you look for in those opportunities? And how do you negotiate? And is that a skill that actually can be taught, or is that something that's naturally built in? What is your take on all that? Because that's from what I've seen, and I do recall an instance where you and I were discussing the various differences in how to negotiate, and there was a gentleman who tweeted a particular approach, and then you had something that was exactly realistically based on functions of the real world. And I put those two side by side and said, look, this looks the same, but one is subtle and much more powerful, and the other one looks good on paper after it's been done. So that's how I really got to, that's where my interest in you really, kind of shined, because I've always, I've taken classes in the business school for negotiations and all that stuff. And everything I learned, it almost always turned out to be wrong. And so I was always curious. I was like, how come, is it me that I didn't understand it? Or is it just that what's been taught has been taught by people who've never really negotiated? So I wanted to segue that in with your understanding of why game theory doesn't work, and how your approach to entrepreneurialism is your, I guess, ace in your sleeve. And how do you approach negotiations? And what do people do wrong when they set it across the table from you?
Okay, well, let's do a couple of examples. So bearing in mind, deception is Darwinian. So interest. I've got. Let me think about a business has sold 4 or 5 years ago, and there's a much. I'll tell you about the deal and how we did it. Much of this will apply to your question, and it also applies a little bit to knowing when a negotiation starts or finishes. So we're selling a business in the UK which sells made to measure blinds online. Really nice business. You put the dimensions of your window in, choose your pattern, your material, click pay, It's printed out effectively in Vietnam and delivered back to your door in 3 days. Really nice business. Really, really smart from a technological perspective. Not too many people. Really highly profitable. Great business. It's online, so it's e-commerce business. So you're hoping to get a decent, double-figure multiple of EBITDA on that if you can. Unfortunately, the problem in the blinds industry is virtually everything in the blinds industry is owned by a company, an amazing business called Hunter Douglas. And the story of Hunter Douglas is one of the most incredible stories you'll ever hear. The great-grandfather of the current owners was the largest exporter of machine tools in Germany prior to the war. Because he was the largest Jewish exporter of machine tools, Hitler banned the export of machine tools from Germany in an attempt to bankrupt his business. So within a week, he hired every freight train in Germany and moved his business to Holland.
Smart man.
He gets to Holland. There's a reason why I'm telling you all of this. So he gets to Holland, and sort of 1939, he's looking over the border and he's feeling a little bit uncomfortable again. And as you can imagine. So what does he do? He buries the factory in the ground. And he ends up in Canada as a refugee. He goes back. 1947, he goes back and he digs up the factory and starts the business again.
Wow.
So this is the origination of Hunter Douglas. And the old story that if you look around the table when you're playing poker and you can't work who the sucker is, it's you.
Yes.
So I'm looking at the Sonnenberg family that own Hunter Douglas thinking, I'm likely to be the sucker the minute I sit at this table. Yeah.
Right.
And they dominate the blinds industry, and they're very acquisitive. They pretty much buy everything. They own most things, and even if you think they don't own something, they have a pretty heavy influence in there. There was one or two other potential buyers for the business, but really it was going to be Hunter Douglas if it was going to be anybody. But they pay 5 to 7 times EBITDA. So that's you sat there. You've got a company. It is one of my most favorite companies in the world. With incredibly astute and clever people, and we're sat here in the UK. We want to sell them this online blinds business. So what do we do? So what we do is we don't go to them. We write a lovely book about the business. We call that an information memoranda for the people who like these things. And we print about 8 of these books, and we go to 8 potential acquirers for the business, none of which are Hunter Douglas. But one of them, we know that they have a very strong relationship with Hunter Douglas, and as soon as they receive the book, they will tell Hunter Douglas that this particular business is for sale. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I get a phone call, and this is genuinely a gentleman's name, from a guy called Ard Kuiper, A-A-R-D, Ard Kuiper, and he is not a happy man. He is the European chief executive, European Hunter Douglas guy. Why? I won't do the Dutch accent, but why have we not been included in this process? Do you know who I am? Kind of call.
Right.
I say, oh, it's very nice to speak to you, Mr. Kuiper, and I'm think you are a fantastic business, one of my favorite businesses in the world, but I have a problem. Hey, what is your problem? I said, well, you're just a bit too good at buying businesses. He says, well, what do you mean? I said, well, I've looked at all the businesses you bought before, and you pay 5 to 7 times, and this is an online retailer, which we think, should be in double figures, should be a lot more than that. So he's not very happy with this at all, and he blusters a bit, and off he goes. So then you have the slightly nervous wait, and sure enough, 10 days later, I get a phone call from David Sonnenberg in New York. Hey, Mike. That is my David impersonation. Apologies to David if he ever listens to this podcast. And he explains that Hunter Douglas have been in business for 90 years. They need to move with the times. And if we're able to come and meet with him down in Nice in France, then he assured me that they realize they need to pay a little bit more for a business like this. So if you actually sort of take a step back there and think about what would, you know, your standard consultant or your standard advisor or your non-entrepreneurial person have done, is they would have gone to Hunter Douglas with their lovely book. Hunter Douglas would have looked at the business and said, oh yeah, this is at the top end of our valuation. Maybe they even got 8 times for it. 8 times would have been 40 million pounds. Yeah.
Right.
3 shareholders, one would have got 20, 2 would have got 10 each. Life would have gone on. Everyone would think that's a great deal. Yeah, that's a solid deal. It's a good deal, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So what happened when we did the deal? Obviously, now the whole perspective has changed. You know, Hunter Douglas have had to kick the back doors in to get in to see it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so they walked through the door with an entirely different mindset. And long story short, I think that when we finally get to the final payments on that deal, we'll have sold it for somewhere in the region of 30 to 35 times EBITDA.
Oh, wow. So this was all, was this, so to borrow a phrase, was this your plan all along, or was this just you testing to see what the result would look like when it came through?
Exactly. If that hadn't worked, if I hadn't got the call 10 days later, I'd had to think of something else, wouldn't I?
Absolutely. So you threw them off their game, and they wanted to aggressively chase you instead of you chasing them.
Well, do you know, it goes back to that point. When did the game start? As far as most people are concerned, the game started in a meeting room in an airport in France, but it didn't, did it?
No.
It started when they thought they weren't going to be able to buy the business.
Were they happy with that? Or was everybody like satisfied, even though the price is obviously to your favor?
Do you know what? It has grown like a train. It is unbelievably profitable. It's the reason why the final payment, one of the reasons why the final payment is going to be quite high. But I imagine, I suspect it's one of the best businesses they've ever bought, and the business has performed incredibly. Now, again, that is post hoc, isn't it? You know, I'm glad it has, but you could never have known that at the time.
Of course.
But yeah, no, it's a win-win. Everyone won.
Of course.
So yeah, I mean, I've concertinaed an awful lot in that story, and I've obviously made myself look as good as possible, but
I would expect nothing less.
But that's so there's a concrete example of that. I'm trying to think of another one for you, so to give you an idea. So this is a good, so this gets to one of the things that I talk about a lot, and that's instinct. You know, I think one of the things that the modern world doing is destroying our human instincts. And you know, you want to get out of that intellectual straitjacket, and you want to get reliant on your instincts. Good example of that is a business I sold last year, a company called Camper.
Okay.
And so Camper they sell inflatable motorhome, or RV as you would call them over there, awnings. Yeah. Okay. So previously you put an awning on your motorhome, your RV, takes a couple of hours, and you know, it's all the poles and everything, but more importantly, it takes 2 people. And normally the person that you are assembling your RV awning with will be your wife. And I'm led to believe by certain people that the process of spending 3 hours effectively constructing a tent may lead to some marital discord.
Right.
So what Camper did is distribute an inflatable awning that one person can put up, and it goes up in 15 minutes, and it's more secure and a better experience than a normal awning. So this is you know, it's a nice company, but they don't own the IP for this, by the way. So you know, anyone could go and do it, but they have got a very smart route to market distribution model, which makes it an interesting business. And this business is making, I think, around about 4.8. I think when we took it on, 4.8 million pounds. So husband and wife team, we had an offer from a business over there in the US, Lippitt Components, for 35 million. husband and wife, 35 million,
Wow. Yeah.
58 years old, I think Mark was, happy days, or you would think. But anyway, the second bidder was a Swedish company called Dometic, and they liked the business and they wanted to come and meet the team. So they said, could we meet them in Heathrow? So we met in a hotel by Heathrow Airport, and they brought everybody: CEO, the CFO, the CMO, the counsel, the M&A person. Literally, they had almost the entire board in the meeting, and the meeting went very well. They spent the first hour and a half talking about their business, how it could all work together. And, you could work out they were quite interested in it. So we come out of the meeting, and I'm just walking across the hotel reception area, and I look at the M&A person, their M&A representative, and I think, she's going to stand in the queue for the taxis. Wherever she's going, I'm going. So, of course, I stand behind her in a queue. I said, "Oh, where are you going?" She says, "Hounslow." I said, "Oh, what a coincidence. I'm going there too." So we share a taxi. Yes. So we get in the back of the taxi and we're chatting, and she says, "Look, as you could probably tell, we're really interested in this, from the amount of people that are here, even I could tell." And so she says, "Look, we missed out on a deal in the US. Where do I need to be, on the price?"
Right.
So, what would most people say? You've got to offer 35 million. Most people say 37, 38, 40.
Around that time. Yeah, 40 probably.
See if we can get a little bit more here. So I paused for a moment and I said, "Well, if you come in at 55, you're going to be where everybody else is. If you come in at 58, I can't promise that I'm not going to go around all the other people. If you come in at 60, I can be 99% certain that the client will accept that offer." So 2 weeks later, I am sat in a rather nice corner balcony suite overlooking Lake Como, Hotel Tremezzo. If you ever really, really piss off the woman in your life, I'd take them to the Hotel Tremezzo. Fantastic. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, I get an email from Dometic with an offer of 60 million. Now, what possesses me, what possesses us to, when the first offer is 35, to suggest, the next best offer we got is 35, to suggest 60? It's very difficult to explain, isn't it? It's the benefit of life experience, isn't it? It's instinct. Your conscious brain only takes in so much information. You are, you're processing somewhere in your right hemisphere. You are processing a whole different set of cues. You're processing a whole different sets of information, and you can't. It's very difficult to explain why. But you get a sense, you get a feel for what's going to work. Much of it is years of experience, but there's a lot more to it than that as well. What instinct is, what is it? A greater appreciation of non-formalized information, to try and define it. So if you are in some sort of intellectual model, you're never going to model 60 million out of that, are you?
No, you'd quote unquote priced yourself out of that deal.
Yeah. And yet, you end up getting, and there's lots of implications of this story, apart from, again, making me look really good. How do you value a business? Where is value generated? So there is reams of nonsense written about DCF, discounted cash flows, God knows what else.
How do you value a business?
Well, you can't, can you? So if you think of that business itself, the shareholders of that business had spent 12 years, hard work, You know, practicing all the good things, the serial redundancies and the search for arbitrage, and doing all the good things to build that business. And yet there is an argument to say that 25 million of the value out of 60 million value was generated in 2 minutes in a taxi from Heathrow to Hounslow.
Of course. That's
So
why they have you on the team, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, or somebody like me.
So
But
here's my question for you, though. What do you say to them when they're looking at you saying, you know, even that first deal may be good? You're trying to calm their nerves on their behalf because that information is going to flow to them. Because I see what you're trying to do in this particular instance. Because what you're doing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you're reading, quote unquote, the room, right? So you see the excitement on one side of the equation, which tells you that these people are serious. But at the same time, you kind of have to quell your side to say, listen, I know you're getting excited. Just calm down and let me just see what I can thread this needle through. So how do you keep your clients in check so that they don't jump at the first offer that instead of, let's say, 35 million, if they said 36 and your client just jumps and says, we'll take it? How do you prevent that from happening? What's your strategy on that front?
Well, one of the things that they don't tell you about negotiation is that is probably the most important thing you'll do is manage your own side's expectations.
Yes. I've been involved, and I've failed every single time because of that very reason.
Well, I suspect that's why, or I did suspect, although I maybe have a slightly different view now. The first time the US and China trade negotiation fell over, and literally everybody thought it was done. I suspected that might have been what happened there. That somebody hadn't managed the expectation, because you've got negotiators in the room who then come out and speak to their, you know, whoever their superior might be, and I suspect that they hadn't managed their expectations of their superiors, and that's why the plug got pulled. But certainly managing the expectations of your client, managing the expectations of your own side is as important as anything that you do to try and make gains against the opposing side.
Right. Okay, yeah. No, I mean, I've experienced this twice, because what happened was I had a family friend of ours who owned a pizza store, right? And it was, you know, making their lives happy and whatnot. And
which store? Sorry,
a pizza store.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
It's, you know, a small thing, whatever. But the point is, at the end of their, near their retirement, they wanted to sell it. And the gentleman across from us was this younger man whose father was basically funding him purchasing various businesses. And so they called me in to say, hey, can you help us out with this? And we sat there, and before we went into the meeting, I said, listen, all you have to do here is be polite and nod and smile. And if they ask you questions, give them the least amount of information, but, you know, present yourself professionally. But when it comes to the business part of it, let's hear them out. And then we're not going to say anything until we go away. So that was the agreed upon solution. The first number that came out of his mouth, my people just jumped on it, and I said, well, there you go, right? Like, you just lost everything, because the first offer that he was going to put on the table is not the final offer he's willing to pay for it. But that's what happened. And no matter how much I tried to explain to them that you have to kind of sit down, let the process, you know, take care of itself. We're not buying French fries at the store here. We're selling a business, and it may take 5 months, it may take 3 months. You don't know, but don't put yourself in this constraint of, oh, I must get this deal done within this meeting. That first meeting could be just get to know the other person, you know, tell them a story or two, because what you really want, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the best negotiating position in any business is the position that you can walk away from. So if you have to do the deal, you're probably not going to get the deal you want. But if you don't have to do the deal, then you can just wait out for the one that the best one they're willing to offer you. Would that be on the right path according to your experience, or am I out to lunch as well?
Well, there's a few things to unpick there. I mean, the best position to be in a negotiation is to have walked away in the past. Is to have a history, or for people to know that you are a capable of walking away. I don't like the ultimatum game in selling businesses at all. I don't like the take it or leave it. Just does not work. Selling business is too complex. Right. So but sort of going back a little bit into the start of your story, in terms of, you know, what could have been better in selling the pizza shop. You know, what I would have done is the first thing is you have to coach your client. You know, so you spend a lot of time with your client first, explaining what to do, what not to do, common pitfalls, and the thing I always say is, no matter if someone mentions a number or offers you a number, you have to be non-committal. It doesn't matter if it's the value is beyond your wildest dreams or it's insulting. You have to play a straight bat at it and be completely non-committal, because getting into the meat of it, negotiation is dynamic. It's non-linear, it's emergent, models don't work. And what that really means is victory is emergent. And by that I mean, if you do get the result that benefits your client, it never looks exactly like you thought it would.
Right.
And that's so if you don't really know what the outcome's going to be, it's best to avoid making too many assumptions about what a good or bad offer is, or what a good or bad set of terms are in the first instance.
So would you say that the number one lesson to learn, at the very least, if you go into it, and if at least you get this part of it right, that you set yourself up for success, is to not let time and space be a constraint against you, and to let it unfurl itself as you see fit, so that you can say, hey, I appreciate your time, I appreciate your gesture, we're going to just take a little bit of time to think about it. At least that way you're removing the pressure from your side of the equation. Would that be at least the smallest and yet most effective thing you could do right away when you walk into negotiation?
Never give anything away unless you want to give it away.
Right. Sometimes I remember you and I were talking, sometimes you just want to give something away just to throw them off the track, right?
Exactly. I'm not saying you never give anything away. I mean, these sort of negotiation 101s talk about never giving anything away, make sure you get something in exchange and all this nonsense. Sometimes you want to give something away to see how they react. Sometimes you want to give something away at the beginning so they get the wrong impression of what kind of a negotiator you are or how strong you are. Sometimes you give something away that people might think you're inexperienced, or it's certainly been to our advantage that we are a small corporate finance advisory or a small investment bank. The big boys think they can push you around, and you want them to think that. Sometimes you want them to become complacent, you want them to become certain. Certainty is a pretty uncomfortable place to be. So you don't necessarily want to appear any one particular way. You have to be fully flexible, fully adaptable. It's the Bruce Lee line, isn't it? You're like water. Be like water.
So the question to you is this: that are people naturally born to be good negotiators, or is this a skill you can teach?
I think you can learn to be better.
You can learn to be better. Okay. So when you're teaching your kids, because you've watched them grow and you've seen their personalities mold and emerge over time, when you watch that, does that reinforce what you just stated, or you're I'm sure you could tell if two of your children are negotiating, you could almost predict who's going to win the deal if it had to come down to nuts and bolts, right? So in that regard, how do you impart what you've learned through your experience? Because clearly, your children are going to have a better life off when they start than you did. So the question here is, and the reason why I ask you this is because you and I have had these conversations before, is as a parent who has a child that's not had it as rough as you have, you still want them to have that quote unquote killer instinct. So how do you teach killer instinct to somebody who's never had to hunt, is my question. Actually, that's really, if you go to the bottom of the well, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, that's a really interesting question. So I'm going to come at it a couple of ways. I guess the first thing I'd say is I'm not sure you do want to teach the killer instinct, because I am here, a certain amount of path dependency to get to this point. I'm not sure I would want anyone else to experience some of those experiences, because I do feel that, whatever the terminology we might use, but challenges in childhood are really what give rise. I mean, I think I call it post-traumatic growth syndrome. So what would you would go all the way back to your anti-fragility question? I think some of us become stronger in adversity. But in order to develop that killer instinct, in order to become very, very good at negotiation or entrepreneurialism or any of those things, you have to have the adversity, and I think you have to have it when you're very young. So I think, and there's so many examples of it. I think, migration, it's incredible when you look at the top 10 businesses in the US or top 10 startup businesses in the US, 8 of them, I think, are started by immigrants. Right. People who come into a different, and all the stresses and strains that brings when you come from you move into a different country, you walk into that classroom and you're different to everybody else, right. And that, and everybody experiences that in a different way, but it's not without its challenges in most instances, I imagine. And I think somewhere in the mix that triggers something. So I think if you want your kids to have that about them, and you do see this in successful people where they make their kids' lives difficult purposefully. And it doesn't necessarily mean wealth doesn't necessarily mean that your childhood is going to be a bed of roses. Right. In the UK, I don't know if you have it so much over there in Canada, but in the UK, wealthy people send their kids to boarding school.
Right.
Yeah, my theory that entrepreneurialism is a function of childhood adversity. I was explaining it to a guy once, and he said, "No, I have a fantastic relationship with my parents. I still have dinner with them every Sunday. We had the most wonderful relationship growing up. I had an idyllic childhood every time I came back from boarding school."
The irony of that is just oozing.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I certainly take in the view that I also think it's dangerous to try and construct this kind of reaction out of your own kids. I think when it comes to bringing your own kids up, I've never attempted to teach them any of these skills particularly. What they absorb, what is implicit, what they see and feel around them, that'll be going in somehow, and I can certainly see it. They've certainly picked a lot of it up, right. But it's implicit, not explicit. As was one of the most important. I guess the fundamental answer to your question is that it is much better to absorb things that are, whole and implicit, rather than bits and pieces of models put together. Do this and then do that, or to try and recreate something which was a function of so many, an incredible number of unlikely interactions as to be impossible to be recreated. You can't make it explicit. You can't make what happened to me or most entrepreneurs. You can't make it, into a model that can be followed. So I think my answer to the question is you can't explicitly teach your children or anybody, but you can. There may be an implicit absorption of what it takes. There may be that.
Fair enough. The thing is, I have experience with two things, right? When it comes to the business side of things, one is sales, and the story I'll relate to you. It's kind of fitting is that I worked at a gym selling memberships just because I wanted to experience that side of the business, and the owners at the time were like, well, we offer you a base salary of this much per year, and then we give you a commission of this percentage. And so I said to him, well, take the salary off the table and just increase my commission. And he kind of looked at me, and he was, because everybody kind of needs a layer of certainty so that they feel like they should come to work and they'll have their bills paid and whatnot. And I said to him, that's true, but at the same time, if I did that for you, then you would own me, because you would tell me what time I could come in and what time I could leave. But for the freedom of being able to leave and come as I see fit, I'm willing to trade off the fact that I can work for the first 3 weeks and not see a dime of it. So he looked at me in a way that was rather like perplexed. And I worked, the first 3 weeks of that, I worked almost 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every member that came into that gym knew me because I was reading all of them. I was talking to all of them. I knew who they were and who their friends were, and recommendations would come in. And in that industry, the way it works is they have this thing called a walk-in, which is like when somebody just, no advertising, they just walked into the gym. And that's a really fresh, hot lead because you didn't have to pay for that. And the argument was that if you can close 33% of your walk-ins, your business becomes sustainable in less than 2 years. So each sales rep is, obviously your numbers are calculated for how many leads were given to you versus how many you close and how many walk-ins were given to you. And the industry average was 33%. And I managed, for some weird reason, to bat over 80% on that. I don't know how I did it. I still, to this day, if you ask me how I did that, I don't know. But I knew that because if I didn't make a sale, I wouldn't have any food and I couldn't pay my bills. I would find ways to have a conversation with the person as they walked in to get all the possible reasons they would say no to buying a gym membership in a casual conversation before we even talked about buying the membership. And that instinct was kind of honed in because, like I said, for the first 3 weeks, I couldn't make a single payment for any of my bills. But afterwards, I used to go in for 2-3 hours and I would make enough sales that would beat everybody else for the whole week. And then I would be like, all right, boss, I'm out. See ya. And he couldn't say anything to me. And I'd leave work on Friday afternoon at 1 o'clock and it drove him bananas. But he knew that I only ate what I killed. And so he didn't have any say over my time. And that experience of learning to fend for yourself in that particular environment, he brought me back in and he said, I want to pay you extra, but I want you to teach the rest of the crew how to do exactly what it is you do. And that was my first experience of exactly what you just stated, which was I said, okay, let me see if I can model this. And I utterly failed. Every single person I tried to teach these skill sets to, they almost instinctively revolted against it from a subconscious point of view. They kind of thought that there's no way that works. There's no way that's how it should be. And so that came back to me to realize that, you know what? Some people are wired for this. Some people aren't. And same thing with negotiations, right? Because when you're selling a gym membership, you're asking a person to invest a significant amount of their time and significant amount of their money into a business that you're going to profit from. And sometimes they don't even come back. They'll buy the membership for the year and they don't really show up anymore. So it's sort of one of these things that kind of goes hand in hand. There's a feel to it. There's really no way to model this and write it out. Because I tried 6 variations. Every single person I was teaching, I would say, okay, well, maybe that didn't work for this person. Maybe I don't understand it myself. So let me try to, quote unquote, remodel and rationalize it a different way. And I walked away from all of that realizing that, you know what, I don't know how I do it. I think it's mostly luck. And every person I've tried to teach it to, they've gotten slightly better, where I can say, yeah, you know what, they have a little bit more confidence in doing it. But could I say to them that if I was running a business, I would bank on that person to run it for me and we would be successful and profitable? I would say no. So it sort of fits into what you were just describing. And I instinctively kind of understand it, but I still fail to really explain it to people in a way that would be sort of digestible to the average person.
I think I can explain it. I think I can explain why you're successful, right? And it's rather like when you do start a business, you're actually supposed to have no money when you start a business, because that gives you the ability to learn. What having the base salary, what having too much capital in a business do is it insulates you from reality. It insulates you from experience and it insulates you from learning. So by the 2 old cliches, constraint breeds creativity and necessity is the mother of invention. Your grandma knows, and you put yourself in a position where you had to. You had no choice. I've been in a situation, and you find a way. When you put yourself in a position where you can't put food on the table, when you put your position where you can't pay the bills, you'll either find a way or you won't. Right. And so you'll either be euthanized by evolution and you'll fail, and we won't be having this conversation, or you learn. And in those first 3 weeks, you learned to read the people, and what you did is you accelerated the process, because the thing that enabled you to learn how to sell to those people wasn't a model of how to sell gym memberships. It was a model of dropping Ace in the shit and see if he could swim. Yeah. So the only way to teach it to people is to drop them in the same pond. Orson Welles, you've accelerated something that a lot of people are capable of doing, okay, but they rarely do. And Orson Welles, I don't know if you've ever watched any of the interviews with Orson Welles on YouTube. If you have an afternoon to fill, or if you're sick one day and you just want to spend a day in bed, just YouTube Orson Welles. He's one of the greatest interviewees of all time. But he tells the story about the night clerk in the hotel.
Okay.
So he comes on at midnight, and people arriving late, maybe a late flight or a late bus into the city. They arrive, they want to check in after hours, and he looks after those people, and he can sell a standard room, a deluxe room, or a suite. And people come in the first year, and between midnight and 6 a.m. and they book one of these rooms, and after a year or so, he starts to be able to recognize what kind of room someone's going to book by the way they're dressed and the way they, if they have some Louis Vuitton luggage, they're going in the suite. If the shoes are a little scuffed, they're taking the standard room, and he gets reasonably good at this in year 2. By year 10, he doesn't even need to look. And what you've done is accelerated the process of instinct by having to sell the gym memberships, not being able to support yourself if you don't sell the gym memberships. And so it isn't really about the process of selling gym memberships. It's about you. It's about the salesperson. And it's interesting as well. This goes a little bit back to the negotiation point, something I think we touched on previously when we've previously spoken. But a lot of people talk about tells, and poker and reading body language and so on and so forth. And one of I theorize that you don't really need them. That you already know what people are thinking. All humans, we already know what people are thinking if you are in touch with your instincts. Right. If you can drop your assumptions, if you can turn off your filter, if you can ignore conventional wisdom and maybe even forget your education. Yeah. Mm-hmm. If you could do all of those things, you actually don't need to see that someone's looking up to the left or whatever. All this nonsense that's been written about this kind of stuff, and I suspect that you got in touch with your instincts, and we as humans get in touch with our instincts when we put ourselves into extreme circumstances.
Right. No, that I'll relay one quick story to that, and I'm going to tie in a bigger point that you and I are going to discuss about. There was this other gym I worked at where I was a personal trainer, but I didn't sell memberships. The manager of that club, who was in charge of sales, he implicitly just was drawn to me. And what he used to do was, whenever all his sales associates were busy, and I happened to be just standing around, drinking a coffee or whatever, he would say, "Ace, if there's a lead, I'll give it to you, and you can go and give him a tour because I know you'll close it for me." And so the story got interesting because one day this gentleman walked into the club, and one of our sales reps, she was just wearing her workout clothes, and she wanted to go do her workout. And she kind of looked at him, and she said, "I'm not going to help that guy." And she said, "I'm just going to go do my workout." I looked at him. I said, "That's the first guy I want to help." And so she's like, "Well, have at it. Go nuts." So I walked over to the guy, and he looked completely disheveled, right? But I looked at him, and my approach to any kind of dealings that I've ever had with people is to give them the opportunity to fail in front of me, right? I don't want them to fail in the sense that I expect them to, but I want to give them a chance to if that's what their inclination is. So he saw me, he shook my hand, he said, "Listen, I'm a truck driver. I don't have more than 15 minutes. I need 4 memberships. How much is it?" And I said, "Oh, you don't want a tour?" He goes, "Nope, let's just do it right here, right now." So we pull out the contracts, and she saw me getting his signature. She saw 1, 2, 3, 4 papers, and she was completely livid. So the gentleman dropped all the money, and he, swiped it with his credit card, and he just went about his merry way. And he said, "Oh, when I come back with the family, would you mind giving us the tour then?" I said, "Sure." So as he's leaving, she was just beside herself because that would have put her over her quota. And she called the manager over and said, "Oh, that sale was mine. I should have gotten that lead." And I said to her, I said, "Okay, but remember, you told me to take it because you looked at him and you judged him because he looked like somebody who didn't belong in this club." I walked over to him and I said, "You know what? Even if you look this way, the fact that you walked into this gym tells me that you potentially want to be a member here. And maybe you don't want to be a member now, but maybe you'll be a member later. As long as I give you a good impression, who knows what may transpire." But she, as you said, she did not drop her assumptions. And as a consequence, she lost an opportunity to capitalize on a sale within 15 minutes that most people wouldn't have gotten in 4 hours.
The second rule of sales is never assume.
Right, right. And this ties back to something really interesting to what you originally stated. And here's how we're gonna transition this conversation, which is you said that money hides your mistakes and it shields you from reality. So we're gonna touch on a subject that's near and dear to my heart, which is I'm gonna give you a theory and tell me if if it's completely wrong, and then I want your take on it. And so here's my theory. My theory is a couple of guys in the Silicon Valley invested in businesses that were profitable. When those businesses went public, they became billionaires off of it. Using that circle of billionaires, they decided to invest in all sorts of nonsense businesses that are currently spiraling out of control when it comes to valuations. And the reason they keep making money is because they keep convincing other people that these businesses are valuable. And when these companies go public, they pull out their money. And if you just measure their point of view of, I started with X dollars, now I'm worth 10 billion, and then I took these other companies that you may not think are profitable or worth anything, but look, when they go public, I still make money, I'm still profitable, therefore my model is reinforcing and validating itself. Whereas you, me, and the rest of the crew look at this and be like, look, Uber is not profitable. WeWork, or whatever that thing that just came out, is not profitable. Where is the delusion, and how is this cycle being perpetuated from your point of view? Because I've seen you talk about these businesses and these ridiculous valuations, and nobody really speaks out about it. And in fact, I think it was yesterday you were just critical of one of the noise-generating tweets about Y Combinator. So I'm really interested in your take from a person who's run not only businesses, but actually profitable businesses, as to what your take is and what's going on with the madness that is Silicon Valley.
Okay, so I'll start sort of at the sharp end of Silicon Valley, and really it's one of these ensemble individual godicity problems that there's a real misunderstanding. So if I'm Y Combinator or venture capitalist, you as the entrepreneur are the few. I'm searching for fat-tailed returns, and you as the entrepreneur are the fuel. So the stat yesterday was 1 in 1,000. Successful Y Combinator candidates are successful. From the VC's perspective, great. But you as the entrepreneur, you've only got one life. If you're dead, you're dead. Yeah.
Right.
So everybody, I literally everybody who attends that conference, or that Y Combinator event is falling for the oldest trick in the book. It benefits the guy sat on the stage to have as many people there as possible, because he pays no real price for your failure, but you pay the ultimate price for your failure. So,
right.
so starting at the bottom, the whole, this idea that in some way VCs are, good for the individual entrepreneur. Just read what their business model is. They're not hiding it. They burn through as many of you as possible. I mean, he said it, didn't he? Move fast and break things. That is the opposite way to which you should behave in business, but is exactly the way that you should behave if you're making, hundreds of bets looking for an outsized return. So, the VCs aren't entrepreneur friendly. VCs are VC friendly. There's more bullshit been written about that, more bullshit spouted by the Andreessen Horowitzes of this world than you could ever imagine. Their business model is to burn you. Let's not get away from it. The chances of you being successful will be despite, not because of. And they are looking to harvest the fat tail. And you are the fuel in the engine to generate that fat-tailed return. You are not, and this is why you get called a founder. You're not an owner. You're a founder because you're somebody who was there at the beginning, but you're not going to own very much at the end.
Right.
By the time it gets to the end, you're down to about 11%.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky, and unless some extreme cases where the Facebooks of this world where you manage to keep control, but in majority of cases you are the fuel in the VC machine, and they are using you, and they don't hide it. It is there in all of their stats. There's been loads of papers written, power law returns. Just Google that, power law returns in venture capital investments, and you will see there it is, nicely laid out. And what your role in it as an entrepreneur is to die. Your role is to fail. So that's the first delusion. And I think the fundamental delusion at the bottom of it all, because everybody sees it the other way around, and it's these warm, cuddly VCs are somehow good for the as an individual entrepreneur. They're not good for you at all. It's just survivorship bias, and we are all prone to it. We look at, even the most successful ones didn't get that much venture capital. Bill Gates didn't get that much venture capital. So that's that end of the equation, if you like, that end of the spectrum. But then on the other side, so the second half of the question is what is happening? What's happening with WeWork? What is happening with these businesses that are valued, on no metric that we can define. They're valued purely on narrative. But I think that the crux of the answer to the question is in order for narrative to work, you have to look at the context in which the narrative, the story is being told. So when it comes to the valuation of WeWork, when it comes to the valuation of all of these loss-making businesses, Uber, I include Amazon in this. When you look at this, it is because contextually the narrative is working. And what is the context? The context is a period of monetary policy, of easing, of money printing, quantitative, whatever you want to call it, and zero interest rate policies or very low interest rates, which has resulted in the environment that we find ourselves in. And it is an environment where people can, raise debt far too cheaply and far too easily. So the narrative that sells a business like Uber, or the narrative that sells a business like WeWork, can only work in this context. So you've got to look at both. They're obviously businesses that are valued on a story, they're valued on a narrative, and that narrative itself can only fly in a certain set of circumstances, and those circumstances of as a result of the crisis in 2008, the central banks have decided to the irony, of course, is that they wanted some inflation, and what they've got is asset inflation. So I think that will be why they are valued as they are.
Fair enough. So in that particular regard, our friend David's question sort of peeks through here, which is that nature creates opportunities for anti-fragility to flourish. Human beings, by default of our affinity for quote-unquote efficiency, all we do is create fragile systems. So in this particular example, based on what you just said, the 0% interest rates and all that, all it's doing is allowing more fragile things to come into existence. So this ties back to what David wanted to know from you, which is that the most dangerous and least aware people that ever lived is basically how the current generation will be described. Do you think that's true? And if so, why is it true?
Oh, I think that because we have the greatest capacity for good or ill of any generation or of any people who've ever lived. We are capable of destroying the entire planet. I think the climate change argument is a little bit of misdirection. But if you take a step back from that and look at what we actually are doing to the planet, we are certainly destroying it in its current state. You know, we've polluted the oceans with plastic. We've you know, we've got mass extinction events. The reason we are the most dangerous is because the power that we have to build, as you describe them, these fragile systems. So, and at the same time as building these fragile systems, is we've become, how would I describe what we are? We've become mechanical. You know, I think it's that rationality, you know, the mechanical following of logic, whereas reason combines this, you know, this following of logic with the fruits of experience. We just don't do that anymore. You know, our attention spans, we've forgotten, you know, how we got here. We've forgotten how we got here as a species. Rationality leads us to believe that our minds behave like computers. You know, it leads to a mechanized view of society. It doesn't take into account emergent properties.
So, given what you just stated, none of which I can disagree with, how do we encourage a shift back to what necessarily allows human beings to mimic nature by creating more anti-fragility around them? What would you recommend the steps people could take in their own business, if they're running one, or in their corporate sector? And we're going to touch on that because you and I were discussing the idea of false security within the corporate structure, and then massive layoffs where the minute they're about to be laid off, the manager who was managing you is so afraid of the consequences of their actions that they don't even step into that room. They just send an HR rep and say, hey, we don't need your services as of today. Here's your package. See you later. So tie all that back into what you just stated. How would you advise people to operate in this world and in this environment, knowing that a potential reset is on its way?
Well, that's a very, I think in the macro, I would describe my position as optimistic in the micro and pessimistic in the macro. So I think from a systemic point of view, and I think I've said it before, the real battle at the moment isn't sort of a political battle between left or right. It's you know, it's between command and control technocrats and adapt to survive emergence. And the command and control technocrats are in charge, and they're warehousing risk at a previously untested rate, and ultimately there has to be a blow up of some description. But the thing is, this fragile system can go on for a long time. It can certainly go on for our lifetimes. But I, you know, I'm sorry to be pessimistic on the macro level. I don't really see much that we as individuals can do. I think that system has got away from us. I think we've seen, you know, there was and you know, the history of humans isn't democratic. Democracy, I think democracy was the key precursor to economic development, and I think we're witnessing a reduction, a rapid decline in democracy. So the attempt from an individual to try and make some difference to a system that is becoming increasingly fragile, I think is difficult to see how that could happen now. People are further away from decision-making process. You know, what the average person would want in the UK or in Canada or the US is very, very different to what the politicians do. So I'm pretty pessimistic that there's much that any of us can do. But on an individual level, you know, we are all capable of changing the way that we understand the world.
Right.
There are some things in the world that can only be understood via experience. And we seem to have forgotten that. And the list, you know, sex, walk in the mountains.
Yep. Driving a car.
Lifting heavy weights for you guys.
Yep, definitely.
Flow,
Swimming,
music, ritual, ceremonies, having children, working with other people. These are all the things that give life meaning. And as individuals, we already know this. You know, it's like I said before about tells and the fact that you already kind of know what other people are thinking if you can let go. But of course, what we're doing at the moment is the opposite. You know, technology separates us from nature. It separates us from what makes us as human. It literally puts a screen in the way. So as a, you know, if you know, it's a little bit more even, and I probably have a wider definition of entrepreneur than just somebody who maybe, you know, would grow a business. You know, this is, you know, so if we want to, you know, become more aware of our instincts, we need, there's certain things we need to do. You know, we need to get outside more. But the thing is, you know, there's no such thing as eternal progress.
Right.
There's only volatility. Cultures wax and wane. The thought that there's such a thing as eternal progress flies in the face of history and experience. So it is inevitable that this society will come to some sort of end. You know, are we getting any happier? Wiser? Are we living in harmony with the planet?
Nope, none of that I could see.
So, I mean, I'd argue that we need saving from ourselves.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Is it John Gray who said humans gain knowledge at accelerating rate without ever learning from experience?
Yep. I think the point of that was the idea of harnessing, quote unquote, the power of the nuclear weapons while not recognizing the consequence of what that may entail, right? Sort of what you just said earlier about the power of being able to blow up the earth. So in this particular regard, a couple of things come to mind, and with regards to the people around me and how I interact with them, and I try to tell them about the simple concept that I've sort of come to understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, obviously, please. Is this notion of local currency and global currency. What I mean by that is there are people who work inside corporations and they become experts within a very small pocket of whatever that organization happens to be doing. And that's a local currency they accumulate. But the minute they're let go of that from that company, they're essentially useless outside of that company. Whatever they put on their CV to get that next job is almost entirely useless. Whereas a global currency is sort of the type of stuff that you're talking about here, the type of stuff that Nassim talks about in Encerto and all the crew talks about in terms of emergent properties, which is that, you know, acquire skills that are transferable in the face of uncertainty. And so this goes to David's point, which is that when you have founders, like you stated, they look into the unknown and bring value back from that. Whereas when you put the business people in charge, they look internally and they try to maximize the KPIs that are already been established. Therefore, they're not harvesting new potential fields. They're just milking the same cow that's already been in existence. So given those two factors, the notion of embracing uncertainty is the only thing I could see as a way out from this. Would you agree or disagree with that? And if so, please elaborate.
I agree with it completely. And the way that you embrace uncertainty is through redundancy. So interesting, if you look at it from a corporate and entrepreneurial perspective and think about the way an MBA type person would fund or run a business, and think of it the way an entrepreneur would run a business. And this is something people can practically think about in terms of redundancy. Interestingly, as an investor, redundancy reduces the return in your investment model. Yeah. If you look back at and debt increases it. So redundancy reduces the return, in your investment model as an MBA guy coming to invest in a business, and debt increases it. This is the way you look at it. Now, take a step back from that. Does anyone really believe that debt causes businesses to be successful? It's insane.
Right.
Debt. How can it's wet pavements cause rain. But this is the returns model. Now look at it the other way around. Redundancy increases your chance of survival in uncertain times.
Exactly right. The second kidney is necessary.
Debt is a hand grenade bouncing down the stairs of your life.
That's a very colorful way to look at it.
Although debt-funded deals return a higher rate than non-debt-funded deals individually, across the economy as a whole, returns are ultimately lower. And to sort of look at this from a sort of more practical sense, an example I quite often give is imagine that we are entrepreneurs and we own a chain of, say, 100 pizza restaurants. Mm-hmm. We own the freeholds. We make profit. We've got cash in the bank. We've no debt. We've got a nice business. Anyway, you wake up one morning and say, do you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. I want out. Mm-hmm. So we bring in private equity. So what did private equity do to that business? They sell and lease back the freeholds. Mm-hmm. What does the MBA, what does that Harvard MBA tell you to do? Is to maximize your debt capacity to roll out as many pizza restaurants as possible. So suddenly now we don't own our restaurants anymore. We are indebted to the bank. We have a private equity loan note in the business. You've gone off and put several $1 million in your pocket and you're happy. And then the fashion is essentially restaurants are a fashion business. Eating's fashion's changed. No one wants to eat pizza anymore. And everybody wants a vegan burger restaurants. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you and I originally, when we owned our freeholds, had cash in the bank and no debt, would have cycled our restaurant chain through from pizza places to vegan burger places. We would have taken some pain. We would have lost some money. We may have closed the odd store, but we'd have got through it. We had redundancy.
Yep.
What happens to the private equity guy, the MBA guy? Do you know what? The business goes bust. And do you know what he says? Nobody could have seen it coming.
Right.
Nobody could have predicted it. And the whole point of all of this is what the entrepreneur says. Yes, I agree. I couldn't have predicted vegan burgers, but what I can do is predict shit. Whatever shit is coming. I do not know exactly what it looks like, but it is coming. And that I think goes to the heart of the difference between the two types of people, if you like. So I guess that's it. How do we benefit? How do we learn in our own lives is to add that level of redundancy. You're not trying to predict the shit that's coming down the tube, but you know it's coming. And you can reverse it around the other way as well. You can't predict the good stuff, the happy accidents that are coming, but you know they're coming too. So you have to give yourself opportunity both ways.
Of course, that's actually funny because as you mentioned that, I noticed three things popped into my head actually. One, I recall there was a time when there was a massive expansion of Starbucks. And I think the people who were guiding that procedure were all the MBA types. And they were basically overstretched to the point where there was a Starbucks across from a Starbucks, which the idea was that if we own the market and corner literally every angle of it, we will be better off. And of course, that just closed a bunch of stores down.
Well, everything's a Laffer curve.
Right. That's exactly it. And that's what makes it funny is because the second company that followed that same principle actually went completely out of business, which was there's a company, I'm not sure they have it in the UK, but in Canada, it's called Quiznos Subs. And the way they distinguished themselves from all the other sub places was that they gave you these really nice toasted sandwiches as opposed to the regular ones. And they did exactly what you described, which is that they went into massive debt to ever expand a business without taking into consideration, which is Nassim's idea, which from the internal volume, when he was talking about, when they were telling him, how do you know what company is going to do well? And he said, I don't know, but I can tell you which ones are not going to do well. the ones that are burdened in debt. And I think the gentleman forgot to ask the follow-up question, but Nassim gave the answer to it anyway, which is that why do you think debt-burdened businesses are not going to do well? And his answer maps perfectly to what you just stated, which was that incurring debt is a form of arrogance in the sense that you can predict the future well enough that you can not only pay back that debt, but make money off of that debt. Therefore, you put yourself twice at risk because now you're going to have accelerating harm come your way should the vegan sandwich idea take off and your pizza store now been, fully stretched beyond its normal capacity, is going to crumble.
Yeah, he should have said debt is a hand grenade bouncing down the stairs of your life.
That would have been much more memorable for sure. But it sort of ties exactly into it because what I like about all this stuff is that it goes back to the other concept of the high IQ individual sitting across the table from someone like you in a negotiation, right? So in that particular instance, I can only see you, to quote Joe's favorite term, pantsing them because you stated that there's nothing more you look forward to than to sit across the table from a high IQ individual when it comes time to negotiation. So what exactly tips you off knowing that the person is A, high IQ, quote unquote, and B, that they actually believe that that's actually true? And how do you take advantage of that kind of person?
Well, actually, at the time I had the high in inverted commas, and there was a little bit of provocation in that tweet, I think, as well. Just but what I actually mean is, and Nassim's touched on this, and I've really enjoyed his destruction of the IQ industry. It's something I've talked about for a long time. But what I really mean is the people that get into the circular professions. So the professions that you progress in because you have a high IQ. So there are plenty of people with high IQs who will be formidable. But despite I think IQ is only predictive of two things. I think Nassim got it slightly wrong. Actually, absolutely got it right. Where there's a disability, but I think he missed the gullibility end that IQ predicts, or certainly. So there's certain professions where the progress through the profession invariably or in many cases can be via similar tests to that of the IQ test. So law, accountancy, consultancy, they're closed systems, so you can progress in a closed system because you're not exposed to the hand grenade of uncertainty. And so you really want to be negotiating with those people because they've never learned. I guess that's the irony. The only way you learn in life is failure. Right. So if you think about the progress to being a partner at PwC, you pass all your exams at school with good grades, you go to university, you get your accountancy qualification, your economics qualification, you get your training contract in PwC, you pass your professional exams, every box ticked, all nice, all straightforward, all predictable, controllable. There's no pigeon jumping on your chessboard. But you've not learned a single thing.
In
fact, what you have learned is that the future is predictable because you've operated in a closed system. The only way the future can be predictable is within a closed system, and that's your only experience. So if all you know is the ratio of one thing to another, then you're going to be destroyed by an open system. You're going to be destroyed by the infinite possibility of an open system. And that's why you want those people on the other side, because it's the hubris that you're looking for. I could have said hubris. I want some of this side of the table to have an incredible amount of hubris, but given what was going on in the IQ debate, I thought it'd be much more fun to say high IQ. The hubris, the thought that we can understand and control everything. That's where the high IQ hubristic professional sat in his ivory tower. That's where he is.
Right.
And we can't. And this is what I go all the way back to what I said that negotiation is a dynamic, non-linear, emergent process. You want the other person on the other side to think linearly. You want them to think that you pass an exam, therefore you get a job.
Right.
There's no exam out here.
No, I remember you and I were discussing this, and it sort of harks back to this point. When I see these type of arguments, I always think to myself in the following way: no matter how intelligent I may be, my finite brain cannot encompass the infinite universe. Therefore, as a starting point, for me to assume to have control over external factors is to only deceive myself, and therefore to put myself at a disadvantage if I was sitting across somebody like you and we were negotiating. Because clearly, if I thought I was smarter than you, or if I thought I was smarter than the whole process, all I'm doing here is being my own worst enemy. You know what I mean? And that kind of ties back into what you just stated, which is the level of hubris. If you believe in your own high IQ and you believe that IQ is real, and then you continue to operate under those assumptions, you will set yourself up for that asymmetrical opportunity that may come your way, and you will get you either hit ruin, which will take you out of the game, or you may get humbled by a potentially significant loss, not one that totally destroys you, but one that kind of helps you kind of temper down your expectations of what you think you know versus what's possible to know.
Well, what you've done is you've subjugated your instinct, and I guess one of the important messages that I would like to get across in this podcast is humans evolved instinct and humility to deal with an uncertain world.
Right.
What the formal education, what the formal methodology into these types of jobs is via the application of models. Now, maths can't help you when outcomes are incalculable.
Right.
So these guys, they become a hostage. What's what I'd say? A hostage to certainty.
Right. And I want to follow up on that on the following patterns. Right. So this is going to get really interesting for you really quickly, because we'll look at two characters. On the one side, you have the ex-KGB colonel who became president of Russia. Clearly, the path from his starting career to where he is now was rife with uncertainty, and I'm sure various activities, the likes of which we wouldn't want to participate in. And on the other side, you have Donald Trump, who everybody, and I always tell people, I'm like, the worst thing you could do is assume the man is stupid, because clearly he isn't. But if you're sitting across a negotiation table with Trump on one side and Putin on the other, what do you see when that situation transpires? What kind of a dynamic do you foresee when those two sit across from each other? Because clearly, both of them aren't the type of people who've checked off any kind of boxes on anybody's list of constrained formal systems. They appear to be both nonlinear in terms of how they got to where they are. How do you see it?
Well, I mean, it's interesting when you think of it. Just take Trump, for example. I don't think Trump's particularly great, but the pond that he swam in when he entered politics was just full of people who were truly incapable. So I don't think he, I suspect he wasn't a billionaire. He may well be now. I suspect that much of what he was myth. But I agree with you. He's definitely nonlinear. He's definitely unpredictable. He's much more capable than his Democratic opponents will ever be. So he will continue to win, in my opinion, until I don't think that the political system in the US is capable of producing somebody on the Democratic side to, with the kind of attributes to oppose him. Who can win in the game that he's playing. So I think right, whether you love him or hate him, we're probably going to be stuck with him for another 5 years. But so I don't think he's particularly amazing. But I think I said it before. He's the president of by far and away the most powerful country on earth, and the dynamic that I would see between Putin and Trump is Putin knows that. So he's playing, and I think everybody who deals with Trump at the moment is playing a game of lose as little as possible. They're not playing the game to win. They're playing a game to minimize losses, and to get small wins where they can. And I think that will be the pattern that emerges. I'm absolutely convinced that a trade deal will be reached with China. I think there's some benefit now for Trump in the lead up to sort of postulate that China's waiting for a Democrat so they can have an easier negotiation. So I can see why he's kind of playing around with it at the moment. But I think ultimately he will get what he wants. Because he holds all the cards, and America holds all the cards, certainly at the moment. So I think the dynamic isn't as complicated. I think people probably over complicate the dynamic. Trump Z, Trump Putin. He's got the cards. He should win. It's just a case of how. How does he get there? What does it look like when he gets there? And like I always say, you can't predict it. Victory is emergent, success is emergent in negotiations. It never looks like you thought it was going to look. So it's very difficult to say, but I would suspect that the dynamic in all cases is loss minimization on behalf of everybody who's not America.
Fair enough. So I have a bone to contend with you on this, on one area where I think we actually found some level of disagreement, and it was a minor level of disagreement, but it was actually noticeable because you and I usually tend to be on the same page, which was that sometimes you could tell that a business deal is going to be a bad deal before it even starts. And I get your point, which was to say that you don't know until you get started. But my point, counter to that, was that we know when the person who's been given the opportunity to run that business has been handed the keys to the kingdom, funded by their rich parents. So that's one instance of it. And the reason I want to bring that up is because it's going to tie into exactly where you live with regards to Brexit and the EU, because my professor, one of the only guys I actually remember in school who I still to this day respect and I sometimes reach out to and stay in touch with, his PhD thesis was that how bad the idea of the euro was. And they almost didn't give him his PhD because clearly they wanted the opposite narrative to be true. And he stated that regardless of what you see as efficiencies gained, what you're discounting is the cultural differences that will fight the norms that are going to be pushed from one location of Europe across the rest of Europe. And that was his sticking point. He said, look, all your models aside, some people just operate differently. And as soon as you start to dictate to them, they will revolt against it. And so considering where you live, how do you see all this unfurling? And what was your first inclination when you heard about the concept of the EU? And that is one of those instances where you can almost see that it's a bad deal, that it's going to fail. You just don't know how bad and how long it'll take for it to fail.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I don't think we disagree particularly. I think I was probably being picky on whether we know. I'm deeply suspicious of whether we know anything. An outcome, there's always surprises. No matter how clever we think we are, we all get surprised. But no, I mean, the European Union is, the euro is flawed. You can't have currency union without fiscal union. You can't have fiscal union without political union, and it doesn't appear that there is the appetite for political union. If I was the European Union, I would want the UK out, because we are an impediment to fiscal union, certainly, and political union, definitely. So, whether or not there's an appetite in this country to stay or leave the EU is one thing, but whether there's a majority in this country to be in a federal Europe, I would say that absolutely, definitely there isn't. So ultimately, you would think they would want us out, and I think the only reason they don't want us out is because of the economic predicament they're now in, where the potential of losing one member is one thing, but then the precedent that sets for people like Italy and so on and so forth is another. So I think they have painted themselves. Everybody's painted into a corner now. I think I said earlier, what history and experience tells us about every attempt to have something similar to the European Union in history, has blown up. And I'm reasonably confident that this one will blow up too. My instinct is many people on, in our corner of the Twitter world is decentralization is best. I've already talked about the democratic problems that we face today and the effect they're going to have on economic development. And I certainly think that's the case in Europe. I'm not completely convinced that we chose the wrong time and then we chose the wrong people. So it's very difficult at the moment. I think I annoy a lot of people being reasonably ambivalent on Brexit. Look, I think Europe will break up. I think the UK should, absolutely leave if it can't join the party. I think we chose a bad time and we chose the wrong people. So we've ended up in a very, very difficult situation.
So answer this for me, because I've always found this curious, right? So I listen to both sides of the people who are anti and pro Brexit and all that stuff. And I always say, what you could do is you could actually revert back to what used to be the way each country operated, but keep some of the good stuff that did come out of the whole European Union concept, like some of the ideas that were beneficial. You could still retain them and say, look, yeah, we tried this experiment. It didn't work out the way we thought it should. But what we could do is we could just do a new iteration where we can go back to what we know always did work, but we could incorporate some of the valuable lessons we learned. Why does it have to be a binary 1 or 0? Why can't it just be like an emergent solution to state that, hey, some of these ideas were poorly thought out. Some of these actually were surprisingly good. Incorporate those back and let's revert back to the last state of the system, which we knew was semi-functional relative to what's happening today. Why isn't that conversation ever being had? Why has it always been a 1 or 0? Or is that just the media and the way they want to portray all this? Are people in your part of the world, are they actually having a nuanced point of view in this nuanced conversation to say, what can we salvage that may be good while we revert back to what we know used to work?
People in power never give the keys back.
Yes, so the first rule of government is to grow its size, right? To maintain its legitimacy so that it can continue to operate. But what about the people on the ground?
The neoliberal project is never going to wake up one morning, look around and say, do you know what? We tried the interventionism thing. That didn't really work out. The monetary policy, well, that seems to have stored up an incredible amount of risk. The European Union project, yeah, we seem to have 50% youth unemployment or in our southern states. We've got all kinds of people voting to leave. They're not going to wake up one morning, do you know what? Maybe this liberal project hasn't worked. No, what you're going to get is just more liberalism. There's no chance of them picking the good bits out. Their answer to the failure of their project is you need more of it. You need more Europe. You need more easing. You need more intervention. We just haven't done enough of it. And the people who are leading the neoliberal project, or the people who are running this game, they don't think that it's not working. They just think we're on the curve. We're on the line to this halcyon world that somehow, the last vanity of man, that in some way we can change who we are and what we are. And they think we're not there yet. So there is no chance that these people will give the keys back and say, does somebody else want to go?
No, it sounds to me like the whole old argument of true communism has never been tried, true socialism has never been tried, true European Union unified solution and kumbaya has never been tried. It seems like that same mental block that prevents reality from sinking into some people's frame of reference has permeated this conversation as well, from what you're telling me. Because I have friends in Europe, and invariably this is an issue that's almost always divisive. Even if I try to bring it up with nuance, I'm painted in one particular camp or another, regardless of what I say. So you're closer to it. What's your feel like at the ground level? What are people really like? Boris Johnson supposedly going to fulfill the promises that have been made and yet never kept. What's your take on all that at that end of it? Like, is there a true concern that this was a bad idea, that they may want to try to do another vote and stay in, or is it like this is a done deal? We're just waiting for the clock to tick down on it.
The establishment doesn't want to leave.
Right.
That's clear. The press, we had Obama stump up and tell us not to leave. The establishment doesn't want to leave. So I have predicted all along that we will never leave. I stand by my prediction. I don't trust Johnson as far as I could throw him. He is of the establishment. He is Eton. He is Oxford. He is from the same world as the people who got us into this position in the first place. I don't think for a minute he's not. And I suspect they're softening us up now for a watered down, ever so slightly watered down withdrawal agreement, which is leaving in name only and basically leaves the country subject to the European Union in many, many ways for a long time coming, or we get another extension and they will bide their time for a second vote. So I suspect that ultimately we won't leave. There is no nuance or subtlety in any of the arguments on either side, or particularly on the Remain side, whose attempts to to paint the Leavers as somehow racist has been one of the most disappointing features. But also on the Leave side, they came up with some numbers and some nonsense that didn't really hold much water, which they didn't really need, I don't think. So there's no nuance on either side. We are completely polarized. I'm instinctively a leaver, but not in these circumstances, not in these people doing the negotiation. They're going to leave us in a worse position than we were before. So even those of us who want to listen to both sides are paralyzed by, Mrs. May was a Remainer. We had somebody who literally understood zero of what we talked about today in terms of negotiation. So we were never going to get anywhere with what I think. Just as an aside, one of the funniest side effects of the sort of the debate for me has been the Remain argument that this is the best deal we could have got, and it is made consistently by actors and comedians. So I decided to do a little research into these guys and see how many of them have an agent. They all have an agent, which is interesting. So when they're negotiating their book, film, and television deals, they don't think it's the best deal they could have got. They feel the need to bring in a professional negotiator to go and get them a better deal. But when it comes to leaving the European Union, apparently we don't need a professional negotiator. We just need somebody who used to work in the settlements office of the Bank of England who's got a geography degree.
No, but you know what's funny about that, and I pardon me for laughing in a derisive manner, is the Never Chamberlain solution to the problem has never been really considered, right? I mean, if there is ever an example of a person who should not have ever negotiated any deals, it's Never Chamberlain. And that lesson should have been the core lesson taught to all school children since that war, which is like, look, this is how you clearly not do this. But it seems like that school of thought never really took off. And so we're left with what you're explaining.
We live in the Seinfeld world. There is no learning. There is no learning.
That's it's a little disappointing, but you know what? There's always hope for at least the reason I started this podcast, and it's very simple. It's like there are pockets where nuance matters. There are pockets where recognition of the fatality of certainty matters, right? So we wanted to get these voices out, and your voice is definitely one of the more sought after ones. And the reason I want to bring that up and to tie it back into your previous point is that you mentioned Boris Johnson's experience at Oxford, but you and I have also had a conversation where you had your education. How did you put it? the only white kid in town, and you had to learn real fast. So can you elaborate on your experience and expertise from that time period of your schooling?
Well, I think it relates back to how you were able to sell so many gym memberships. You know, I went. My father worked in Nigeria, and I was the only white kid in the school there. And you learn very quickly to read the expressions of the other kids. You know, when you stand out,
Right.
then you know, and you're smaller than everyone else. I'm a big guy now, but at the age of 13, I was a skinny white kid, and my friends over there were a lot bigger than me. And you learn very quickly to read your fellow classmates, you know. And I think we've spoken before. You move countries also.
Yeah.
When you're a new kid, you learn very quickly to read your new classmates, and that's what you were doing when you sold the gym memberships. You were employing that embodied skill, that you would learn via the experience you had when you were much younger. And yeah, no, I had quite a scary time. Not too many white kids playing soccer in the African bush in the 1980s.
Well, you know what's interesting on that front is that I learned, and we talked about reading people, but there's another layer to this that I learned instinctively, which was not only did I learn to read people because I obviously get bullied, but I learned to read people in a different situation I was in. So if I was in one of the hallways where the teachers didn't really roam that much, and I was walking through there, and I knew the certain kind of characters that would gain pleasure out of tormenting me, I knew exactly when and where to avoid those areas. So it's not only knowing the people you're going to deal with, it's also knowing that there's potential opportunities where they will maximize their advantage over you in those particular opportunities. So I learned how to navigate not only the people, but also the environment at the same time, because if you pay attention to one and not the other, you will find yourself in a situation that may not necessarily be tenable to you and your ability to avoid ruin, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You mean you learn to rely on your instincts.
Yeah.
Your instincts enable you to deal with an uncertain future. So this is how you become skilled. Yeah.
So I appreciate your time. I know you wanted to set aside just about 2 hours, but I do have a couple of quick questions from our fans. If you want to just quickly fire off some quick responses to those, if you have time, or
yeah, no, sure. I've got a little bit longer. I'm just about to drive off to pick my youngest daughter up from a festival. So, but I've got a few minutes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, question is this: how long does an average negotiation last for you? What are the time bounds that you put on yourself in space and time when it comes to how you prep? So, people want to emulate the teachings that you've been telling us about. What's your process like? What do you do?
I don't have one. Don't have a process would be my answer to that. Avoid all processes.
Okay, perfect. What was the biggest mistake you ever made negotiating, and what lesson did you learn from it?
That's a difficult question. Mistake negotiating. I think early on in business, the mistake that I made most regularly was leaving money on the table, because I had that constraint. We didn't have any money. We didn't have any capital in the business. It was just throw the money in, throw the deals through the door. And that was a learning process. That was a learning process to realize that actually, if you slow down a bit, and take your time, there is probably a better deal to be had. By my biggest mistake in negotiation would have been going too fast.
Okay. The next couple of questions are going to be quick ones, but here's the one. How do we humanize the entrepreneurial process so that we can actually help people who take risks without basically bringing their life to a ruined point. Because if you are going to embrace uncertainty and risk, the odds of you hitting ruin are going to be a lot higher than somebody who doesn't. So in your opinion, how do you humanize that process so we can encourage more of it and try to protect them on their downside?
You can't. You're supposed to have the threat of ruin. That's what makes you better.
So get on the high wire without the safety net is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, and the last question from David is, at a time when everybody's trying to be right, how do we go about seeing the information for what it is versus reinforcing what we believe it to be?
Seeing the information for what it really is.
So it's like how do you recognize you're in the Kobayashi Maru, so to speak? Is I guess the bottom end of that question. Like, how do you know when you're in the Kobayashi Maru? How do you know when those boundaries that you spoke of are things to, sometimes boundaries are good, sometimes they're not. How do you know when you should step outside of it versus stay inside of it? You personally. Experience
and instinct. And the thing that I've started to think about a lot recently is how to get more in touch with your instincts, how to get more in touch with intuition, how to get more in touch with that part of you that understands the whole rather than understands the bits, which is essentially what this question is, isn't it? Is how do you understand the whole? How do you take a step back? And I think we are in a world that has been designed by the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere looks at the world as if it's made up of bits put together. And what the question's really asking is how do we look at the world as a whole? Left hemisphere narrows down to certainty. And I think the answer to much of this is context. So it's to trying to see everything in its context rather than in it broken down into its individual pieces. So how do you go about doing that? So it's easy to say it, isn't it? It's easy to say, don't have a bureaucratic mind, don't follow explicit procedures, don't look for predictability, organizability, try to be individual, try to be unique, try to be embodied, flexible. And then I guess that is the basis for understanding, isn't it? But that it's one thing to say it. And the next thing is how do you do it? How do you make yourself more right hemispheric, for want a better way of putting it. I took a month off Twitter. I took a month off all screens, really, apart from work, emails and messages and stuff. And you feel all of those things coming back, the ability to see things as a whole. You feel it all coming back to you, whereas, we are surrounded. We are immersed into technology, which removes us from the business of embodied existence. So I would have said, how do you do that? I think you have to remove yourself as much as you can from the technology, from the screens, from the constant interruptions, and from having a screen between you and reality.
Fair enough. So it's, on this point, I guess, as an insider joke between you and me is you don't want to be stuck in the room taking notes, right?
Sorry, I missed that one.
I said you don't want to be in the room stuck taking notes.
No.
And then passing the notes around to all the people as opposed to just enjoying the atmosphere of what's being stated in the room, verbally and non-verbally.
If you're successful, you get someone else to take the notes for you.
Thank you very, very much for your time. Do you have any last parting thoughts that we didn't get to cover for you?
Oh no, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. You're an excellent, very knowledgeable, widely read interviewer. I just hope the interviewee was able to live up to the interviewer.
Oh, But you exceeded all expectations, and you did live up to Convex Man as the nickname that you have been ascribed to by the crew.
I'll take that one. I might have a t-shirt.
You should. You definitely should. All right, Mike. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ace. It was wonderful. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Welcome. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we have. The truth is, any worthy conversation you'll ever have will inherently be a risky conversation, as long as it's open and honest, where ideas are exchanged and emotions swirl. Thank you for listening. Be anti-fragile and carry on the ancient tradition in your own unique way, by saying what only you can say and doing what only you can do. Abiding by Milton's words, this is Emma Sadat signing off, wishing you the very best of worthy and risky conversations.